Hi, everyone. This is Mark Kerr with the Center for Self-Governance. Thank you guys for joining us tonight. We're really pleased to have KrisAnne Hall to join us tonight. She, because of her schedule, is not able to join physically for the presentation, but is going to join by phone call at the end of her presentation that she's pre-recorded for us. And so at this point, we're going to go ahead and turn this over to KrisAnne Hall.
I'm also an author.
Somebody else. Go ahead. And then Pam, you need to unmute yourself. Whoever has the 816 phone number. Whoever has the 816 number, you need to mute yourself. Probably. And the problem is you're not going to, the audio.
Hall, and I'm a constitutional attorney. I'm also an author, a national speaker, radio show host, television show host, and I travel around the country and I teach the Constitution to all sorts of walks of life. High school, middle school students, college students, adult groups. I teach religious liberty in churches. I have a course that I teach to state legislators. This is the course that I'm going to be teaching you tonight. The course on the constitutional role and duty of the state and local governments. I also have a course that I teach to law enforcement groups, and very happy to see that course spreading throughout America. And I want to thank the Center for Self-Governance. I want to thank Pam and Mark for giving me the opportunity to come and teach you this evening. I do have to apologize. This is not your typical webinar. I am not doing this live. But because of my schedule and the way I travel and teach so much, I have to record this for you. And since this is a recording, I need to ask you to please, I am doing this to benefit the Center for Self-Governance. I don't usually do these types of things for other groups, but I really, really believe in what the Center for Self-Governance is doing. And I believe that if America is going to be restored to its foundational principles, the Center for Self-Governance is going to be a necessary and vital aspect of that restoration. And so I am doing this for their benefit. So I want to ask you, please, don't record this message. Don't disseminate it under any other terms. Let's make sure that we can do this for their benefit. My website, just straight up front, is KrisAnneHall.com, KrisAnnehall.com. You can catch any of my articles, my videos, my television show, my radio show. I am on Facebook. I am on Twitter. You can find my books. I've written 5 books, 2 children's books. And so I want to just start off with this lesson. I want to tell you right away, this lesson takes over an hour to teach. So what we're going to be doing is giving you a really brief crash course on this constitutional role and duty of the state legislator. So I'm going to hold on this slide. I'm just going to hold on step by step. To also understand that these are building block lessons. So as we move along, each step will build upon the other. So I want you to please make this an education trip. Take advantage of this, take notes. Make sure that you have your paper. Lots of quotes. You need to open it right now to the Declaration, to the last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, and just sort of earmark that because we will be using that later. So this is not so much me teaching you the constitutional role and duty of the state and local government, but me facilitating a lesson that our framers have already tried to teach us. It's really, I think if I were to accurately title this class, would be the proper operation of a constitutional republic. How does a constitutional republic, how is it supposed to operate? We are not, and I'm sure you can agree, we are not operating as a proper constitutional republic. As a matter of fact, in knowing history and the forms of government that exist, we are actually operating more like a federal kingdom. But we can fix that, and that's what this course is all about. How? How do we fix the federal government? Because you do not fix the federal government through the federal government. Sending up new politicians to the same old broken system is not going to fix Washington, D.C. That's ludicrous. That's like having a car broke down on the side of the road and thinking that you're going to make the car drive by changing out the drivers. That doesn't work. It can't work. And our framers never intended it to be working that way. They did give us a solution for when the federal government escapes its limited and defined box. And that's what we're going to study today. What is that solution? It is not electing a presidential messiah. It is not replacing Congress. As a matter of fact, it's not even a Supreme Court justice magical appointment. It is something more powerful, something bigger, something stronger, and something guaranteed to work. I mean, you roll the dice every time you elect somebody these days. You never know what they're going to do. But this is a guaranteed solution given to us by the men who created our constitutional republic. It is the state and local governments who are supposed to be controlling the federal government. Why? How? What does that mean? See, we've got to build some real foundational building blocks. We need to understand that we have failed to teach the right things for so long. We are being pulled along by a siren song of solutions that are not solutions, things that will not fix. I mean, think about this. We have the majority, oh my goodness, almost an entire replacement of the House up for election in November. And yet America is completely consumed by one election, one office, and two people. Completely consumed. And that's not even where our solutions are. But think about this. Of all the offices that are up for election in November in Washington, D.C., how many more exponentially are there to be elected in your state and local governments? That is where your power lies. Because if you have a constitutionally operating school board, the federal Department of Education has no power in your school district. If you have a constitutionally minded city council or county commission, your local community is immune from federal encroachments. If you have a constitutional sheriff, this is the most powerful office in your jurisdiction. If you have a constitutional sheriff, then the FBI has no jurisdiction in your county. The EPA, the FDA, the USDA, the BLM, the ATF. These agencies are null and void in a jurisdiction with a constitutional sheriff. If you have a constitutional state and local government, governor, attorney general, House, Senate, guess what? The federal government is not your provider, and it is not your bully. You control the federal government. That's the design. That's how it's supposed to work. But we keep electing people who don't do their jobs. Why do we keep electing people that don't do their jobs? Because we keep electing people who don't do their jobs because they don't know what their jobs are. They have no idea what their job description is on the state and local levels. Why don't they know what their job description is? Because we don't know what their job description is. And I want to read to you the words of the General Assembly of the Commonwealth of Virginia, January 23rd, 1799. These legislators are making a plea to the people of Virginia. And in this plea, they are going to give us the best job description of your state and local representatives. Listen very carefully. It says, unwilling to shrink from our representative responsibilities. We want to do the job you've hired us to do. But we can't do it without you. So it would be deceitful in those entrusted. Entrusted. Here's your job description. When you elect people on the state and local level, what is the number one thing they have to do? What is the most important task you've elected them to do? Their primary job description. What is it? Well, the legislators from the state of Virginia are going to tell us. To be the guardians of the state's sovereignty. That's it. The number one job responsibility of your state and local government is not economic improvement. The number one job description of your state and local government is not education, land management, or business regulation. The number one job description of your state and local officials is to guard the sovereignty of the state. You see, if you cannot guard the sovereignty of the state, then you are not operating in a constitutional republic. And if the state is not sovereign, then it's a colony. And we do not live in a republic, we live in a kingdom. And if that's the case, we are not freemen. We are subjects of a federal kingdom. Number one, you must guard the sovereignty of the state above everything else. Because once you guard the sovereignty of the state, everything else falls into place. Oh my goodness, if we actually had really functioning sovereign states, our states would have such a level of prosperity, we wouldn't even know what to do with ourselves. So, these legislators from the state of Virginia are not even just going to tell us what their job description is. They're going to tell us how to do that job, why they have that job description. So here they say, it would be deceitful in those entrusted with the guardianship of the state's sovereignty. Why is their duty to guard the sovereignty of the state? They said, because we're acting under the solemn obligation of the following oath. I do swear that I will support the Constitution of the United States. If your states are not guarding the sovereignty of their state, then there is no constitutional republic. The Constitution is destroyed. The purpose of the Constitution was to create a limited and defined federal government, putting them in a box, a limited and a defined federal government. If the states are not confining the federal government to that box, then the Constitution is destroyed. The sides of the box are blown off, and you have no more Constitution. If you have no Constitution, then you are not a constitutional republic. You are a kingdom, a federal kingdom. And we are not states, we are colonies, and we are subjects. So, why do we have to guard the sovereignty of the state? To make sure that we are protecting the Constitution. How do you guard the sovereignty of the state? Well, our legislators explained to us that if we are going to guard the sovereignty of the state, we must refuse federal encroachments. Federal encroachments are the sure destruction of the state's sovereignty. Every dollar your state and local government takes from the federal government, any dollar that your state and federal government takes from the federal government, destroys the sovereignty of the state. Because whoever pays the piper dictates the tune. So what happens is your state or local government takes federal money, then all of a sudden the federal government's dictating how the state runs. And if the state has to ask permission from the federal government on how to manage its land, create its laws, establish businesses, and engage in commerce, hey, you are not a sovereign state. You are a colony in a federal kingdom. They said, look, we have to warn you of these federal encroachments, which, though clothed with the pretext of necessity, they said these encroachments are going to sound really good. The federal government is really good at making their money seem necessary, disguised in necessity. Because you know we have to have federal health care, right? You must have federal health care. If you do not have federal health care, we're all going to die. I got bad news for you. We are all going to die. But guess what? It's the same argument that they were using in the late 17, early 1800s. We don't need federal health care to live. But they're disguising their encroachment with the arguments of necessity, the pretext of necessity. They said they will also be disguised by the arguments of expediency. Because you know you have to pass the bill so you can read the bill, right? I'll remind you, this is 1799, not 2016. Why? Because human nature never changes, and government always operates in the same exact ways. So, how do we fulfill the number one obligation, the guarding of the sovereignty of the states, the refusing of federal encroachments? How do we retrain the minds of the people to know that they don't need the federal government in order to live, in order to maintain their land and operate? How do we do that? Well, we have to start by reteaching some basic building blocks. We have to start at the very beginning. So what I want to do is ask you a question. Now, this is because this is a webinar, sort of weird for me because I'm used to speaking to audiences that respond. So I want to ask you a question, something to ponder. Which came first, the states or the federal government? Well, quite obviously the states, right? But if we really believed that the states came first, we would understand by natural law and the laws of primacy who was in charge. So what I want to do is go through with you the chronology of the creation of the states through the creation of the federal government. Because we are not teaching the right things in our schools. We are teaching our students for generations that the states became independent free states with the signing of the Declaration of Independence. July 4th, 1776 is what we celebrate, right? Only that's not true. We did not become independent sovereign states on July 4th. We became independent sovereign states on July 2nd. July 2nd, 1776, the Continental Congress ratified the Lee Resolution. The Lee Resolution is a three-step process to declaring independence from Great Britain. Each state declaring independence through its representatives in the Continental Congress. Step number 1, we are independent from Great Britain. Step number 2, we must form foreign alliances. And step number 3, we must form an immediate confederation of the states. Not a consolidation of the states, a confederation. And on July 2nd, 1776, the Continental Congress met, they debated, voted, and ratified the Lee Resolution into law. The independence from Great Britain of our states was not some random rogue act by a bunch of signers of the Declaration of Independence. The independence of our states was a legally binding, legally ratified, legally debated, voted, and ratified into law legislative act. Just as legally binding as anything that our Congress does today. That's constitutional. So when we understand that our states were actually created independent and sovereign on July 2nd, we must admit some things. First, we must admit that the states existed prior to the Declaration of Independence, because the Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4th. Now, there is no federal government on July 2nd, 1776. There is no federal government on July 4th, 1776. Because we are independent from Great Britain, they are not our federal government. So, when did we get our first federal government? Well, many people may remember from their history lesson that George Washington was not the first president of the United States, because our Constitution is not the Constitution that we have today. Our first Constitution was called the Articles of Confederation. We had presidents under the Articles of Confederation. But the Articles of Confederation didn't work out so well. What happened was that the federal government was given so little guidance on how to do its job. When it was doing things it was supposed to be doing, it was doing them all wrong, and then it was doing things it was not entitled to do. Sometimes it wasn't even doing anything at all. And so we were literally on the verge of multiple wars, wars with foreign governments and wars between our states, because the federal government is not operating properly. So the delegates decided to come together in a convention. The states will now elect people to become delegates to a convention to amend the Articles of Confederation to make sure that this federal government is working properly. Problem is, the convention is called, and they realize that there's major overhauling that has to take place, and they're not going to be able to amend the Articles of Confederation. That's how we get our Constitution. By the way, that's why our Constitution is called the More Perfect Union, because it was supposed to be more perfect than the Articles of Confederation. Now, the Articles of Confederation, in order to be replaced, had to be dissolved. So there are no Articles of Confederation. But now we need to ratify the Constitution in order to maintain the Union. You also may remember from your history or your civics lesson that there was a period in our history where we were about this close to not ratifying the Constitution. And without ratifying the Constitution, there would have been no Union. Prior to the convention, the Union had practically dissolved anyway. The Articles of Confederation were just words on paper, trying to hold together independent and sovereign states who were completely dissatisfied with the agreement and the functioning of the federal government. They weren't any part of it. They're not functioning in this Union. So the Union has been dissolved until it is reestablished through the ratification of the Constitution. Now, thinking about our chronology here, the states existed on July 2nd, 1776, prior to the Declaration of Independence. They are the creators of the Articles of Confederation. But when the Articles of Confederation are dissolved, and the Union is practically dissolved, the only government that exists at this point in time, prior to the ratification of our Constitution, are the states. Now, this is a very important fact to really hold on to, because it's going to make a really big difference as we discover what is the Constitution. But before we get into the details of the function and classification of the Constitution, we still have some work to do on the states. So now that we know that the states existed nearly 13 years before the states ratified our Constitution, we need to know what is a state. This is something that we have forgotten, lost attachment with, or maybe never learned. So this is where you're going to pick up your pocket constitution that I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar. So your pocket constitution, go to the last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. The last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence begins, "We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America." And this last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence is going to tell us exactly what a state is. This, by the way, is also language taken from the first paragraph of the Lee Resolution. This language was copied from the Lee Resolution into the last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. So let's read through this together. "We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare." Now, remember, we didn't become independent from Great Britain on July 4th. We simply published and declared what we had done 2 days prior. Now, let's pause here for just a second, because there is a very important distinction that we must make. A very important distinction. This is July 4th, 1776. And I want to ask you, on July 4th, 1776, was there a federal government? Was there a federal government? Are you very sure of your answer? Because the obvious answer would be no. There is no federal government. Remember, we dissolved our attachment with the British federal government, and now we are independent, free states. So there is no federal government on July 4th, 1776, but we need to be really sure about that. Because there are some people in the United States, way too many for my comfort. They have infested all political parties, all stations of government. I call them federal supremacists. And these federal supremacists have decided that the federal government is superior to the states in all cases. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but they'll tell you that the Supreme Court has established a superiority. They'll tell you the Supremacy Clause establishes superiority. They'll tell you all kinds of ridiculous statements that we are forced to believe unless we know the truth. One of these lies exists within the Declaration of Independence itself. And I want to refer you to the very first sentence of the last paragraph. "We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America." I want you to look at that. Because your federal supremacists will say, look, we were envisioning the federal government. It's right there in the Declaration of Independence. How can you say there is no federal government when the Declaration of Independence says it was the representatives of the United States of America that did this? Well, it's very simple because grammar matters. If you have an historically accurate version of the Declaration of Independence, you will be able to look at that word, those words, United States of America, and know why they're not talking about the federal government. Look at that U in United. If you have an historically accurate version of the Declaration of Independence, that U is not capitalized. Because that U is not a proper noun. It is an adjective to describe the conditions of the states being united in their Declaration of Independence. But there is a movement in America to undermine the foundation of who we are. And the most efficacious way to undermine who we are is to dissolve the power of the states. How do you do that? You make them in subordination to the federal government, as described by the framers themselves. Only they didn't make it that way. They made the states superior to the federal government, not inferior. And so what has happened now is we have people rewriting our documents. They're not so bold and brass as to change the words, but in subtle ways, the grammar, to alter the entire meanings of the documents. Look at that. If that U is capitalized, that means that United States of America is the proper noun. And when you make United States of America a proper noun in that sentence, what you're now saying is the federal government created the states. Now we know that's impossible because the federal government did not exist. But if you are not taught these foundational building blocks, you can be led to believe that it was the federal government that created the states. And if the federal government created the states, then they are not free and independent. They are colonies, and we are subjects. So here's a good test of your version of the Declaration of Independence. Is the U capitalized or not? If it is capitalized, you need to throw it out because it is inaccurate. It is dangerously inaccurate. As a matter of fact, Yale University prints a version of the Declaration of Independence where every single letter in United States of America is capitalized. If that's not a bold and brassy move to make the superiority of the federal government, I don't know what is. Thank you very much, Yale. I guess we know who butters your bread, right? So let's talk about this now. Because this paragraph, this portion of the paragraph is going to tell us what a state is not. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for rectitudes of our intentions, do in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare what? That these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. And now you've just learned what a state is not. A state is not a colony. You see, we were colonies, but now we're states. So what does that mean if we are not colonies? What is a state? What's the difference between a colony and a state? Well, a colony is not free and independent. A colony has no autonomy. A colony must ask the federal government for permission to use their land. The colony must ask guidance from the federal government on how to use their land. The colony must ask permission or guidance from the federal government on how to manage their resources, educate their people. They have to seek guidance and permission from the federal government on creating their laws. Feeling like a colony? Well, we are not colonies. We are free and independent states. So what is the difference between a colony and a state? Colonies are not free and independent. States are. But what is a state in its own right? Well, a state, as we continue through this paragraph, free and independent states, they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and what? Say it with me now. The state of Great Britain. That word state is not simply synonymous with New Hampshire, New York, Rhode Island, or Virginia. That word state is synonymous with Great Britain, France, and Spain. We created 13 independent, free, sovereign governments. They were not attached to each other, and they were not controlled by a federal government. Free and independent governments, just like Great Britain, France, or Spain. They said that these free and independent governments and their attachment with Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have. Now we are about to see the power that the authority of the people have delegated to the federal government. Now let's pause for just 1 second and remind ourselves. Is there a federal government in the Declaration of Independence? No. So we were not delegating this power to the federal government, were we? What are the only governments that existed at the Declaration of Independence? The states. We are about to learn through the Declaration of Independence the power that through the authority of the people have delegated to each and every state. Continue reading with me. Is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. This is the power that your state holds. And I'm talking in present tense, holds. This power was not delegated to the federal government. This power was delegated by the people to their states. Full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states like Great Britain, France, or Spain may of right do. And this is the power that your state holds, because nothing has changed. There has been no amendment to the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution of the United States reaffirms this profession. Now, your federal supremacist friend, co-worker, lawyer, attorney, judge, or politician might try to tell you that, well, that doesn't apply to your state unless it was one of the first 13. Only that's not true. Because you see, that's not legally accurate, historically accurate, constitutionally accurate. There's a long-standing doctrine that exists prior to the creation of our own governments called the equal footing doctrine. That when a state enters a union, when an independent free government enters a union, it enters on the same footing as every previous member. The equal footing doctrine. And there you have, right there in the Declaration of Independence, that full-size footprint. Full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliance, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states like Great Britain, France, or Spain can do. Now, your federal supremacist might say, well, KrisAnne is just reading that all wrong. Because when you joined the Union, you surrendered your sovereignty. You surrendered some power. Also, not historically, politically, or constitutionally, or legally accurate. How ridiculous is that? That you joined a union and became less independent, not sovereign. Just by joining the union, you reverted to being a colony. How many of you have heard of a sovereign government by the name of Germany? Right? Didn't Germany join the European Union? So I suppose with that little bit of information from your federal supremacists, we would be justified in flying over to Germany and holding a town hall meeting and explaining to the German people that they are no longer a sovereign government because they joined the EU. How do you think the German people are going to accept that little bit of news? They're going to laugh at you, call you an idiot. Here's the problem. Why don't the Americans think that way? Why don't Floridians think that way? Why don't people from Colorado or California or New York or Texas Why don't they laugh at the fact that they are no longer sovereign just because they've joined a union? Because we have failed to teach the right things for a very long time. And we've been brainwashed into a colonial mentality. Our states were created as independent, sovereign governments. So why do we act like colonies? Now we're ready to move on. What is the Constitution? We know the states came first. We know that the federal government was created as a product of the Constitution, right? If we didn't ratify the Constitution, there would have been no federal government. So what is the Constitution? What is the nature of the Constitution? Well, very legally, simply speaking, the Constitution is a contract. It is a legally binding contract. And even better so, our framers call it over and over again a compact, which is even more indicative of what we are. See, a contract is an agreement between legally sovereign people. When I say legally sovereign, I mean you've attained the age of legal sovereignty. Can your 15-year-old sign a contract? Well, if your 15-year-old signs a contract, is it a legally binding contract? Of course not. Because in the eyes of the law, your 15-year-old is not sovereign. He's still subject to his parents. So a contract is an agreement between legally sovereign people. But a compact is something better. A compact is an agreement between legally sovereign governments. Remembering our chronology, what were the only legally sovereign governments that existed prior to the ratification of our Constitution? The states. Which means that the states have to be the creators of the compact. Your states are the creators of the compact that created the federal government. Now, your federal supremacist friends, or maybe some friends who are not federal supremacists, just miseducated, will try to tell you or may suppose that the Constitution is an agreement between the people and the federal government. That is not true. And you can show them their error with one simple fact. Was the Constitution ratified by popular vote of the people? No, it was not. The Constitution was ratified by the states. The states are the parties to the constitutional compact. Well, they might say, well, okay, what we really mean is that the Constitution is an agreement between the states and the federal government. That is also not true. It is a temporal impossibility. Let's think about this. When was the federal government brought into existence? When the Constitution was ratified. When the contract was signed, it created the federal government. You cannot be a party to a contract if you are the product of the contract. The federal government is the product. The federal government cannot be a party to the contract. They are the product of the contract. You cannot be a party to the contract. You cannot sign the contract if you do not exist until the contract is signed. It's a temporal impossibility. So when eliminating all other possibilities, the only answer that can be true, the only answer that is true, is that the states are the parties to the compact. They are the creators of the federal government. The Constitution created the federal government. So if the states are the creators of the Constitution, then they are, by that form, the creators of the federal government as well. So now, knowing that the states are the creators of our central government, we know that the states enumerated its specific powers. They created a limited central government, and then they reserved all other powers to themselves. This is the most important thing that our states could have done when they were ratifying the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, reserving all other powers to themselves. But what power went where? Right? So we started off with the Lee Resolution, the people delegating all of the power to the states independently. So New Hampshire and Virginia did not have to share power. They each had their own independent powers, just like Great Britain doesn't have to share power with France. Okay? So now that we've created the federal government and we are delegating power to the federal government, what power goes where? James Madison, who's also called the father of the Constitution, has told us what power goes where in a document that we call Federalist Paper 45. Madison says the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Remember, we made them into this box. Now, this is the same language that is used in the 10th Amendment that reaffirms this relationship. The 10th Amendment states the powers not delegated to the United States are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So Madison is just simply reasserting what we will say again or establishing what we will reassert in the 10th Amendment. The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the states are numerous and indefinite. The power delegated to the federal government, he says, and now he's going to tell us which power went where specifically. The power being delegated to the federal government will be exercised principally on external objects. External objects is how our framers referred to foreign affairs. Now, Madison's not going to wait for the Supreme Court to define external objects for us. He's going to tell us exactly what they are. They are war. This is Madison now. Peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce. Now, didn't we just see those powers listed somewhere else very recently? Turn back to your pocket constitution, to that last paragraph. In the Declaration of Independence, remind yourselves the power that the people delegated to their states. War, peace, negotiation, foreign commerce. Read the Declaration of Independence. The power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may have right to. All that power went to the states first. And now a portion of that power, limited and defined portion of that power, is being delegated to the federal government. So if we know that this power existed in the states first, by the delegation of the people, and now a portion of this power is being delegated to the federal government, who is delegating power to the federal government? You're right, the states. If we really taught that, understood that, and knew that, we would not have this relationship with the federal government that we have. We would know who's in charge by simply knowing the definition of the word delegate. Go look it up in the dictionary. To delegate, a temporary transfer of authority or responsibility from a higher power to a lower power. The people, higher power, delegated the power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things independent states may have right to. The people of the higher power delegated to their lower power, the states, all of this power. And now, the states, being the higher power, delegating to the federal government, the lower power, a portion of their power, war, peace, negotiation, and foreign commerce. By knowing that the states delegated power to the federal government, we know that the states are the higher power and the federal government is the lower power. It's a temporary transfer of authority or responsibility, temporary because it's only effective as long as the delegate does the job the delegator wants it to do. What power then does Madison say remains in the states? He says the powers reserved to the several states. Now, several doesn't mean a few, it means separate and independent. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all the objects which in the ordinary course of affairs concerns the lives, liberties, and properties of the people, the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the states. That's a lot of power reserved to the states. Where is the Bureau of Land Management? It's not war, peace, negotiation, foreign commerce, external affairs. It is the lives, liberties, and properties of the people. It is the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state. Where is the forestry service? Well, that's the properties of the people, the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the states. The EPA, the FDA, the Department of Education, it's still the lives, liberties, properties of the people, and the internal and order, improvement, and prosperity of the states. Every single one of these executive agencies is a theft of power from the states. We have a federal government leaping out of its limited and defined box and stealing power from the states. Jefferson explains this very well. He says, what happens when the federal government uses a power that has been reserved to the states? Jefferson says that whenever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. Why would something that the federal government does, why would that be unauthoritative, void, and of no force? Well, let's pretend that I've stolen somebody's car, right? Do I have the legal authority to drive that car? Of course not. Do I have the legal authority to sell that car? No, I don't. If I sell that car, is the sale legally binding? No, it is not. Why? Because my power over that vehicle has not been legally delegated. I do not have a legal claim over that car, which means any act I exercise over that car is without authority and is void and of no force. That's why the sale is not legally binding. Because the sale is void and of no force because I don't have any real legal authority over that vehicle. And that's what Jefferson's saying. Jefferson's saying that when the federal government uses power outside the Constitution, it is stealing that power from the states. And therefore, since it is stolen power, the federal government has no authority to use it. And any act it performs based on that stolen power is void and of no force. That's amazing, isn't it? What obligation do the people of a state have to follow a law that is void and of no force? Now, this is not the first rodeo that we've been in with the federal government stealing state power. It started fairly early. 1792, James Madison is arguing before the House of Representatives on the fact that they cannot use the General Welfare Clause to collect money from the people to subsidize private industry. That's not what the General Welfare Clause means, Madison says. We're at it again in 1799 and 1800, and we're at it again in 1830s. This is called the Great Debate of 1830. And John Calhoun, who's in this, trying to guard the sovereignty of the state as his obligation is, explains to us another very important word in the 10th Amendment. The first one was delegate, right? Temporary transfer of authority from a higher power to a lower power. The other very important word in the 10th Amendment is reserved. He says the doctrine which denies the states the right of protecting their reserved powers. The right. Now, we don't generally talk about, okay, let me say, we're not supposed to generally talk about governments having rights. Governments don't have rights, they have powers. That's why the 10th Amendment says the powers, not delegated, not the rights. The federal government doesn't have rights, it has power. But now Calhoun is talking about the rights of the states. Why would he be talking about a state having a right? Well, because it comes through the definition of the word reserved. If I am in a coliseum and there is a chair with a sign on it that says reserved to KrisAnne Hall, and someone else sits in my chair, what do I have the authority, what do I have the right to do? I have the right to kick them out of my chair, right? But if the sign says reserved to KrisAnne Hall, and somebody else sits in my chair and I don't have the right to kick them out, is that chair really reserved? Of course not. Because the definition of the word reserved is to exercise dominion over something to the exclusion of someone else. We reserved powers to the states so that the states could exercise dominion over these powers to the exclusion of the federal government. And what Calhoun is saying is this, simply. If the states don't have the right to exercise dominion over their powers to the exclusion of the federal government, then those powers are not really reserved. And if the powers are not really reserved, then what you're establishing is that the federal government has the right to determine exclusively and finally the limits of its own powers. He says the doctrine which denies the states the right of protecting their reserved powers, which would vest in the general government, it matters not through which department, the right of determining exclusively and finally the powers delegated to it. Now listen, if the federal government can determine the limits of its own power and look to the states and say, no, we're going to do education today, and it's not a power that's reserved to you. We're going to handle your environment, we're going to manage your land, and we're going to dictate your laws and policies. If the states must simply comply with these undelegated authorities, are the states sovereign? No, they're not. They're reduced to colonies. Calhoun says this doctrine, which denies the states the right of protecting their reserved powers and divests in the general government the power to determine exclusively and finally the limits of its own power, he says it's incompatible with the sovereignty of the states. Because if your states must simply just do whatever the federal government says, and it doesn't matter whether it's the executive branch or the legislative branch or the judicial branch, because they're all part of the same federal government, then your states are not sovereign. He says it's incompatible with the sovereignty of the states and the Constitution itself. If the federal government can mandate and dictate to the states powers that have not been delegated, if the states must simply acquiesce and comply, they are not sovereign. The Constitution is a compact, which is an agreement between sovereign governments. And if the states are not sovereign, they cannot create a legally binding contract, which means the Constitution is null and void. And we do not have a document whose whole purpose is to preserve the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. We have a totalitarian kingdom. Sovereignty is the key to maintaining liberty. Our states have a duty to interpose, Madison says. They have a duty to step in between you and the federal government and say, no, you cannot transgress your boundaries, because the minute you break out of your limited and defined box, we don't live in a constitutional republic, we live in a kingdom, and that is to the destruction of the liberty of the people. He says, in the case of deliberate, palpable, and dangerous exercise of other powers not granted, the states have the right and are duty bound to interpose. Why do they have a duty? Because we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. There's a single purpose for creating our states, just one, and the Declaration tells us what that is. The single purpose for creating the states is to secure the rights of the people. And if the federal government is not limited and defined, we live in a kingdom and we have no rights, we only have privileges. The states must defend the republic by defending their sovereignty. How do they interpose? Jefferson tells us, the several states who formed the Constitution, being sovereign and independent, have the unquestionable right to judge of its infractions, that a nullification by those sovereignties, remember the states are the sovereignties, is the rightful remedy. The what to control the federal government is interposition by Madison, as Madison explains. The how is nullification. What is nullification? Nullification is the state standing up and saying, hey, you stole our power. We're not going to allow you to exercise it anymore. We are taking back our power. The laws that you create, the regulations that you create, that are based on powers reserved to us, are null and void and of no force. You have no power over us, and we will not comply. It is the designed solution to the constitutional republic. Because if the states do not have the right and the power to step up to the federal government and say, no, we will not comply with your rules and regulations when you steal power from the states, then we are not states. We are colonies in a federal kingdom. And this is how they intended us to fix this. Not through the election of a president, not through the replacing of Congress, but that our governors, our state legislators, our sheriffs, our county commissioners, our city councilmen all step up and say, wait a minute, that's our power, you can't use it. And if you're going to try, guess what? We are not going to allow it. It has no force. Now, as I told you when we started this is only part of this lesson. But if you want the entire lesson, I want to encourage you to go to my website, KrisAnneHall.com, KrisAnneHall.com, and I want to encourage you to get my book, Sovereign Duty. Sovereign Duty contains this lesson. It has a chapter on the constitutional sheriff, on the Second Amendment, on the Fourth Amendment. It has a chapter on nullification and a chapter on Article 5 Convention. The mechanisms of the people to control the federal government. I want to thank CSG again for this opportunity to reach out to you with this so important information. Remember, this is just the beginning of this. If we are going to take back the republic and secure the liberties of the people, we have to be willing to be more than a 1-hour webinar. We have to make this a matter of daily living. We must expect sovereignty. We must demand sovereignty, and we must demand a limited federal government. God bless you guys. Thank you so much for your time, and make sure that you support CSG. Bye.
Okay, KrisAnne will join us for about 10 minutes here soon. If anyone has questions, please make sure to type them into the chat bar down at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. We will ask questions to KrisAnne as they come in. She is at another event this evening, so she's going to be calling in by audio through her phone. Hopefully everyone enjoyed the webinar. We're going to send everyone a link to this, probably get it out to everyone tomorrow morning. Sounds like someone is not muted. Make sure that you're muted just to give respect to the other folks on the line, and when KrisAnne gets on, and we don't have any distractions. So please make sure to type in your questions if you have any for KrisAnne. I'm glad you guys enjoyed the webinar tonight. It was a bit of, KrisAnne just switched over to satellite internet and doesn't have the most consistent. And that may be her.
Yes.
Hi, KrisAnne. Imagine we're talking about you. Imagine that.
Imagine that.
How are you tonight? Hey, thank you so much. That was a really awesome 1-hour lesson. Everyone's giving us tons of very positive feedback.
Oh, great. I'm glad it worked out well.
Yes, it did. Karen Lees, she's from Tennessee. She's actually part of our organization at CSG. She says, excellent message. Could we have permission to publish her message in an article for CSG's Language of Liberty series?
What, in the form of written kind of thing?
Karen, do you want to explain that a little bit?
Tell me what that means.
Yeah. Marty Marshall says, know that laugh. Definitely tell. Okay, let's see here, Karen. I'm going to see if I can unmute you. Hold on one second. Okay, Karen, you should be able to ask or explain what you're thinking.
Great.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you, yes.
Hi, KrisAnne. It's nice to meet you. Thanks so much for doing this webinar. It was excellent. We really
Oh, no,
got a lot
thank
of
you. I
good
appreciate it.
information. And we have the Language of Liberty series, which is published each week in local newspapers. In Tennessee, we're hoping to get wider coverage soon in print. But we do have exposure on outlets such as Freedom Outpost. I don't know if you're familiar with
Yeah.
Tim Brown and the editor of Freedom Outpost, and
Mm-hmm.
on a couple of other websites on each week. And we have very thoughtful articles, and it's called The Language of Liberty, and it explains founding principles of liberty on various issues and various points about the Constitution. This would be an excellent article. It's usually around 1,000 words in print.
Mm-hmm.
This week's was from David Barton. And so you would be we would be very honored if you would be one of our guest columnists. Would it be possible to get this message out?
Oh, sure, absolutely. Are you asking me to write something?
Yes, or if you have something already written on
Well,
the subject.
yeah, I do. I mean, I have a whole book on the subject. The 1,000 words thing's going to be the difficult part, right? There are 2 articles on my website about the states' rights and nullifications. I think maybe if you want to look at those, that might be good. I don't know. What would be the sort of deadline for writing something like that for you?
Well,
Because there'd be no way I would be able to get this message to you in 1,000 words. I didn't even get you the whole message in an hour. So
just a summary is really all we're looking for, just to cover, to get people thinking about this subject, because most people do not understand that the federal government is not more powerful than the states. And
let me tell you what I have. Yeah, I have something that's already written on my website. That's sort of an intro to all of the intro to this intro that I gave you. And what I can do is I can look it over and I will email it to Pam, and you can tell me if that's what you're looking for. How's that?
That would be wonderful. Thank you so much. It is a
Oh,
message
no
that
problem.
needs to be heard. Yeah, we need to start the
Thank
national
you.
discussion on this.
Amen. Amen. And you can always refer people to the book Sovereign Duty, because that's where the complete message is. I mean, that is a veritable manifesto on how you get this done. It's not just simply what our framers said, but how they said to do it as well. And so that's the sort of handbook that we need to put into these people's hands.
Okay, well, we can put that in with your bio at the end of the article.
Yeah, no, that'd be great.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay, so we have another question from Bill and Barbara Ames in New Jersey. They're asking, how do you break the linkage between the states and the federal government in terms of the tax monies we send through the IRS?
Oh, that's a very good question. There are actually 2 states in the union who are doing the correct thing, only they're not doing it together. So if we could get what each of these states is doing into together in one state and then duplicating it throughout the states, we would be very good. North Dakota has a state bank, which means that North Dakota is not subject to the Federal Reserve. They do not, their dollars are not actually impacted by quantitative easing. They're completely outside the Federal Reserve system. The other state is Texas, which they haven't done it yet, but they have a bill in legislation to start doing it, and that is to coin money based on the weight and standard method measure that was created by the federal government. The only power delegated to the federal government regarding money is to create a uniform weight and measure for the money. They're not supposed to be creating fiat monies. They're not supposed to be dictating currency and that sort of thing. They're just creating the weights and measures, and then the states coin the money based on the weights and measures as unified by the federal government. And so the state of Texas has legislation to bring gold and silver back as the standard for currency in Texas. So these are the two things that we need to duplicate throughout the states. And the biggest one, obviously, is the state bank. Because here's what happens. If your state has a state bank, and the people of your state do the banking with the state bank, that means the federal government only has access to your funds with the permission of your state. They cannot garnish your wages. They cannot pull money out of your account. They can't search your bank records. They cannot do anything without the state's permission. And what happens then is you get your state legislators and your governors and your attorney generals on board with the understanding of the proper role of the federal government. And as you're seeing now in North Carolina with the federal government refusing to send them money for this, that, or the other, and I think it's now going to start happening in, I can't remember, there's another state the feds are starting to refuse to send money to. What the people are going to say is, why, if you're not going to give us back the money that we gave you, then why are we giving it to you in the first place? And so what will happen, I believe, at that point is the people will wake up to the illegal nature of the federal government in the taxation system. The federal government was never supposed to have direct access to the people. Taxes, by Constitution, are to be collected through the states via apportionment of a census. And so when you have a state bank, you can have the state look at the federal government and say, hey, you cannot have access to our people's money to spend money that we don't want you to have. So here's what we're going to do. We are going to shield our people's funds from your access. And then the federal government has no access to your money because you are banking with a state bank, and the state holds all the strings.
Awesome. Okay, the next question we have is from Mark Powell. He says, our ignorance and silence has gone on so long. Is our silence considered consent? Have we given away
Absolutely.
Have we given away our sovereignty
Absolutely.
to the nationalists, the supremacists? And is it too late to convince so many? I got to scroll down here. Let's see. Is it too late to convince so many, and too late to debrief and reteach our sovereign power?
Okay, so that's like 12 questions all in one. But yes, we have. Our silence is consent. Acquiescence is consent. And that's what's happened. You see, we have altered the type of government that we actually have by not keeping the federal government in its limited defined box. You see, we talk about things like constitutional rights and constitutionally protected rights. There's not a single person in America with constitutional rights because the Constitution doesn't give you rights. The Constitution is not the source of your rights. God is the source of your rights. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And here's the thing. When we start believing that our rights come from government, then they're no longer rights. They're privileges. And that's not something that's inalienable. The other thing is that we have to understand that we have the power, right? So there's no constitutional rights. There's no constitutionally protected rights. The Constitution cannot protect your rights. The Constitution can't write letters. It can't sit in senators' offices, and it can't pick up swords. Our framers called the Constitution a parchment barrier because it's nothing more than paper and ink. So what we need to know is that not just simply our silence but our acquiescence, our apathy, have all transmuted the very form of government that we have from a constitutional republic to a federal kingdom type of government. I call it an oligarchy of 9 kings and queens because we have sort of abdicated all our power to the Supreme Court. So the question then is, you sort of answered part of the question with the question. Yes, the problem is ignorance. It's not, our apathy comes from ignorance, our silence comes from ignorance, and Samuel Adams said that no people will tamely surrender their liberties nor be easily subdued when knowledge is diffused and virtue is preserved. He said, but on the contrary, when a people become universally ignorant and debauched in their manners, They will sink underneath their own weight without the aid of foreign invaders. And so that's what's happened. America is sinking, and it's not because of ISIS or illegal immigration. It's because we have allowed the federal government to teach us for generations, and they've taught us into ignorance. The last question, is it too late? Well, absolutely not. I think the best evidence that I can give to you that is the class that I teach called The Genealogy of the Constitution. And it's the understanding that there's nothing new, nothing novel, nothing invented in our Declaration, our Constitution, and our Bill of Rights. They're not original documents. There's not even original thoughts within those documents. Those 3 documents are sourced from 5 documents that were written over 700 years. And when you read those 5 documents, you see that ours were not written. They were plagiarized. They're exact duplications of documents that evolved for over 500 years. And so in that history, we see there's always a period of apathy in the people, a falling away, if you were, to the guarding of their rights. And at that point, the government steps up and becomes, as tyrannical as it can be until it steps too far and the people stand up and push back. And so it's never too late. The question is not will we, but when. So it's guaranteed that the people will stand up to government, and they will do it in the name of liberty. The only question we have to answer is, will it be this generation, or we condemn our children to do it? Here's the problem. Our framers gave us peaceful means of restoring our constitutional republic. That's why they gave us a constitutional republic and not a kingdom. But the longer we sit, placated by our comfort and our prosperity, which is false now, by the way, false prosperity, the longer we sit on it, the less peaceful means we have to accomplish the restoration of our constitutional republic. And what we will eventually do is condemn upon our children to bring liberty back into their lives, but they will not do it through the constitutional republic system. They will be forced through the kingdom system to do it.
Okay, so one more question, because I know your time is short. We have, let me go back here.
And I'll just, while you're looking for that next question, I'll just interject here. That's why what CSG is doing is so important, because CSG is employing those peaceful mechanisms to restore the constitutional republic. The peaceful mechanisms to restore the constitutional republic are not electing proper representatives in Washington, D.C. They are electing proper representatives in your state and local governments who will look the federal government straight in the eye and say, no, you have no power over us. We will not comply.
So Paula asks, do you know any examples of how nullification is being used at the state level? And enjoy the webinar, thanks. So.
Oh yeah, there are hundreds of examples. You need to go to a website, 10thamendmentcenter.com. The 10th Amendment Center is another group that is working for the restoration of liberty. I highly support them. I am a lifetime member. And they are tracking legislation, and this is not just the state level that's nullifying, okay? These are counties and municipalities that are creating laws and ordinances on the very localist level saying we will not comply with federal regulations. And so these are the way these things work, and they are working. Kansas passed a law throughout the entire state that said there'll be no federal gun regulations enforced in the state of Kansas, and any federal agent trying to enforce them will be arrested and prosecuted to the highest extent of the law.
Great. Okay, so I don't want to get into any more questions. I know that you are busy, and we just said 10 minutes of Q&A, and we've far surpassed that. But KrisAnne, do you want to talk about what, for those that aren't aware of what you do, kind of, we obviously know who you are, but they may not know that you go around and speak across the country and that you're willing to go wherever you're asked to go and speak on these topics.
Yeah, I have now 12 classes that I teach all over the country. I teach high school, middle school students. I teach college students. I teach adult groups. I have a religious liberty class that I teach, which I'm even allowed to teach in the churches. I have classes that I teach state legislators. The webinar that you have today was in parts the class that I teach to state legislators. And I've taught the legislators of Utah, Arizona, Kansas, Missouri, Idaho, and Oregon. And I will go anywhere and teach them. I have a law enforcement class that teaches the law enforcement their role and duty according to the Constitution. And all you have to do is go to my website. It was up on the webinar several times. And fill out the speaking form and ask me to come and speak to your groups, or arrange for me to come and speak to your county commissioners, your city councilmen, your sheriff and his deputies. I would love to teach your state legislators. I mean, that would be fantastic. All you have to do is go on the website, fill out a form, and then my assistant will get with you, and we will find a date that works for everybody. Because I have no speaking fees. I don't make anybody compensate me for my expenses. Everything that we do comes out of pocket. Now, we are not independently wealthy, but we have people all over America that support us on a regular basis so that we can do this. So we can, and I'm teaching about 265 classes in over 22 states every single year. Not only that, I have the radio show, which airs 5 days a week. On my podcast, the 6th day on Sunday is spread throughout the world on Genesis Communications Network. And I have a television show, and we have the books. If you really, and people like KrisAnne's pushing her books, but if you really enjoyed today's webinar, you have to pick up the book Sovereign Duty. It is not my opinion. This book is not an opinion-based book. This is a fact and history-based book, and it's just me facilitating to you the plan that our framers had because they anticipated what was happening. I know Mark teaches this in one of his classes, so you've probably heard the story about the lady who goes up to Benjamin Franklin, and Mark can probably even tell you her name. I don't remember. It says, "Mr. Franklin, what kind of government did you give us?" And he said, "A republic, if you can keep it." And our framers knew that although the republic was the only way to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, they also knew that it was a delicate form of government that relied on the jealousy and the vigilance of the people every single day. And so they knew history and they knew human nature. They knew the people would slack off. So they actually gave us a plan to put it back in order. And that's what Sovereign Duty does.
Well, great. Thank you so much, KrisAnne. This has been awesome. We appreciate you taking the time to even do the Q&A for us. We've had a number
no,
of
it was my pleasure.
all across the country who were on the call tonight. So from New Jersey to California to Washington State to Florida. So we've kind of got it all covered. So thank you so much. Thank you all for being on the call. Go ahead.
I would suggest that they go to my website and pull up the calendar. As often as I speak, I'm going to be somewhere near you or near a family member where you can come and get an idea about what I'm doing.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you, KrisAnne. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you, Pam. You guys are awesome. You know I love you.
Yes, likewise. Have a
Keep
good night.
fighting.
You too. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, thanks everybody. We'll get this up and squared away to send out tomorrow morning. Probably we'll get this all emailed to you as a link that you can watch at your leisure. Okay, thanks so much. Good night, everybody.